thank you all for joining us today. My name is Lane Norton. I'm the Assistant Dean for Advancement in the Maxwell School, and I'm delighted to welcome you to this virtual faculty forum featuring two of our outstanding faculty members, the Honorable James E. Baker and Professor Jamie Winders. Before we begin, we recognize with respect the Onondaga Nation, firekeepers of the Haudenosaunee, the indigenous people on which ancestral lands Syracuse University now stands. We also acknowledge and support those struggling against institutional racism and structural violence, and who are working toward a better future today. Today's events continue virtual programming from the Maxwell School to engage our faculty, alumni, and friends on important topics of the day. We are recording this event and will post the recording on the Maxwell YouTube channel so that members of the Maxwell community who could not join us today can watch it as well. If you do not wish to have your image recorded, please feel free to disable your video by clicking on the icon on the lower left corner of your screen. We are pleased to provide closed captioning during our program. If you would like to view closed captions, click the CC button in the toolbar. We thank our transcriptist, Sandra Smith, for her services today. Later in the program, you will have the opportunity to ask questions. When we get to that portion of the program, please click on the chat icon at the bottom of your screen. This will enable the chat function so you may type your questions, and your questions will be asked in the order they are received. It is now my pleasure to introduce Dean of the Maxwell School, David M. Van Slyke. Dean Van Slyke is the Louis A. Bansal Chair in Business Government Policy, a tenured full professor of the Maxwell School and the College of Arts and Sciences, and a two-time recipient of the Burkhead Award and Professorship for Teaching Excellence. He is a leading international expert on public-private partnerships, public sector contracting and contract management, public and nonprofit management, and policy implementation. Dean Van Slyke is Director and Fellow of the National Academy of Public Administration and serves as a member of the Defense Business Board and is a member of the National Academy of Public Administration's Expert Advisory Team for the Office of Inspector General at the Department of Homeland Security. He is also engaged in the network of schools of public policy affairs and administration, the Association of Professional Schools of International Affairs, and the University Leadership Council on Diversity and Inclusion in the International Affairs Education. Dean Van Slyke, it's my pleasure to hand over our program to you.
Thanks so much, Lane, and I'm delighted to introduce this virtual program, a conversation between two of our exceptional faculty that will explore a critically important form of emerging technology, artificial intelligence. The impact of artificial intelligence and a range of emergent technologies on national security is in its nascent stages at the Department of Defense. The Uniformed Services, the Office of the Secretary of Defense, and federal advisory boards, such as the Defense Business Board and the Defense Innovation Board, have issued a range of reports and recommendations for AI adoption and integration into the broad mission of the department. But across the whole of government in the United States, as well as internationally, AI is at the forefront of integration into different types of systems and platforms. And the potential influence that AI has on our nation and the world is significant. Governments, firms, think tanks and universities, and many others are debating a range of questions that heretofore have yet to be fully fleshed out. Frameworks are being developed to guide our understanding of impact and our thinking about a range of criteria for development, use, and evaluation. The applications of AI to the work of government at all levels and in most policy and program areas has the potential to not only transform the efficiency and efficacy of what gets done, but there are also areas of concern that need to be addressed. At Maxwell and Syracuse University, we're fortunate to have faculty from many departments and schools and colleges on campus that are working collaboratively on teaching and research to ensure students understand and are involved in these areas of work. And I'm grateful that two of those outstanding Maxwell professors are with us today to speak about AI and its implications. Our participants include Judge James E. Baker, a professor at Syracuse University's College of Law, who also holds an appointment in the Maxwell School. Judge Baker also serves as director of the Institute for Security Policy and Law, which some of you might know formerly as the Institute for National Security and Counterterrorism. It is Syracuse University's interdisciplinary center for teaching, research, and policy analysis involving issues of national and international security and counterterrorism. In Judge Baker's many roles in public service, he has served in the United States Marine Corps, on the staff of Senator Daniel Patrick Moynihan, in the US Department of State, on the Foreign Intelligence Advisory Board, on the National Security Council, and on the US Court of Appeals for the Armed Forces. He has also served for the last 5 years as a member of the Public Interest Declassification Board, established by Congress in 2000 to promote transparency in national security activities. He is a prolific author, and in addition to his just released book by Brookings Institution Press on the Centaur's Dilemma, National Security Law for the Coming AI Revolution, which we'll be discussing today, he is also the author of 2 earlier books. One, published by Cambridge University Press in 2007, titled In the Common Defense, National Security Law for Perilous Times, and in 1992 by Yale University Press, titled Regulating Covert Action. Joining Judge Baker is Professor Jamie Winders. Professor Winders is a professor of geography and the environment in the Maxwell School. She also serves as the director of the Syracuse University Autonomous Systems Policy Institute, a campus-wide institute dedicated to interdisciplinary scholarship and teaching on the design, governance, and wider implications of autonomous systems, and to critically engaging and shaping the policy and ethical frameworks that guide the use and development of autonomous systems. Professor Winders' research focuses on 4 themes, including the design, regulation, and social impacts of emergent technologies, and especially autonomous systems and artificial intelligence. In all of her interdisciplinary work, Professor Winders situates her research at the intersection of academia, policy, and advocacy. Judge Baker, Professor Winders, thank you for joining us. We're looking forward to your discussion. And Jamie, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thank you. So thanks for that introduction, Dean Van Slyke, and thanks to Jess Murray and all her team in Maxwell for making this possible. And we're super excited all of you all were able to join us today. I first sat down with Judge Baker's book earlier this fall. And when I sat down last night to kind of revisit the book and my notes on it, I was really struck by how just in the last couple of months, we've seen so much more attention to artificial intelligence across sort of mainstream news sources. I'm thinking about a number of high-profile New York Times articles that we've seen on topics like AI and suicide prevention among veterans, robotics and racial justice. And so this is a topic that seemingly every day is getting more and more attention. So it's a real treat to get to be here today to talk with Judge Baker about his new book, not only because I really enjoyed reading it, but also because it's such a timely topic. And I think there are really 3 strengths that jumped out at me about Judge Baker's book that I will talk a little bit more about today. And the first is, I think he really shows us just how complicated and how urgent the need to understand AI's implications for national security really are. So he really gets at that complexity. I think the other thing that really stood out to me in how Judge Baker engages AI is that he really lasers in on the entanglement of law and ethics and policy and security and technology, and why it's so important to address this entanglement now via policies before we're in a crisis moment, right? And so the argument he makes repeatedly about why it's so important to manage AI via policy as opposed to litigation. The other thing that I think is really impressive about the book is that it offers a number of analogies or metaphors or templates really for addressing AI governance from law. He draws on industry examples. He also draws on examples from academia. And so the starting point is really AI's embeddedness in so many different aspects of our daily lives, rather than what we often see, which is trying to silo it into these different domains. So basically the structure will be, I'm going to ask Judge Baker questions for about 30 minutes. As you're listening to us talk about the book and about AI, please feel free to post your questions in the chat. We have some folks who are sending the questions to me, and we'd love to hear from you and your the kind of questions and comments that come to mind. So we'll get started, and my first question is an easy one. It's why this book? Why now? What was it that led to this book's creation? And also, how do you explain the title to us? Because there's an interesting story behind it.
Okay, thank you. Thank you to the Maxwell School. Thank you, Jamie. This panel has the convenience that if you just call everybody Jamie, you can't miss the target. So I welcome that, and thank you for the honorific, but we'll go with Jamie henceforth for the conversation. So I'll tell you the origin of the book, and then I'll tell you the origin of the title. The book, so there's a lesson here about careful what you do and what you say. I invited Jason Matheny to give a presentation 2 years ago to a room full of lawyers. And Jason Matheny was the director of the Intelligence Advanced Research Projects activity at the time, DARPA for the Intel world, for those of you who are following along. And Jason gave a talk about emerging technologies, including AI. And I asked him at the end, I said, you're in a room full of lawyers. So I heard your message about how this is coming, but what do you want to tell a room full of lawyers? And he said, apropos of other Jamie's comments about the intersection of law, policy, and technology, what Jason said was, no one's looking at the law and ethics. No one's looking at the law and ethics. The technology is speeding ahead. The national security world is speeding ahead. And we need lawyers to look at the national security implications. So I turned to the room and I said, you all hear that? Someone step forward. Jason wants to talk to you. And Jason said, that's right. So 2 weeks later, Jason calls me up and he says, I found the person to do the study for me. And I said, that's great. Who is it? And he said, well, let's have coffee. And so I said, okay, so I had coffee with him and I'm drinking the coffee and nothing's happening. So finally I said, well, so who'd you get? And he said, you. And I said, Jason, I can't even spell AI. What are you talking about? And he goes, can you look up Wikipedia? And I said, yeah, well, I don't want to admit it, but I think I've done some research there. And he said, that's all you need to know. What I need is someone to look at the law and ethics who understands how government is going to use this wisely and unwisely. And that's your job. And so my joke now, which turns out not to be a joke, is every time Jason asks me a question, I have to write a book. So I've been avoiding Jason, lest he asks me another question. So that's the origin of the book. So why the title? The Department of Defense, which this will come as no surprise to many in this chat session, has been driving the government side of AI development. It was back when in the Obama administration, it was referred to as the third offset. That language was changed in the succeeding administration, but it's been a big portion, a big part of how DoD has approached the century ahead. They got the memo. They didn't get the memo before industry and before academia, but they got the memo. The leading actors in this space is industry, then academia, then the government. But within government, it's DoD. And DoD talks about a Centaur model of AI development and use. And the Centaur model to them is not half horse and half human, but part machine, part human. And so I zeroed in on the Centaur as a concept because I found that most of the ethical dilemmas, many of the ethical dilemmas embedded in the whole concept of AI turn out to find their place at the intersection of where the human interacts with the machine. And we'd like to think about how DoD talks about human machine teaming, which makes it all sound like, you know, perfect symmetry, two people playing tennis or something. But every single application has its own human machine interface, and every application has its opportunity for a human machine fumble. And then there's a great tension here. The embedded tension with artificial intelligence is the advantage of artificial intelligence, and we'll define it in a moment, by the way, but the advantage of artificial intelligence is you can do things with data, you can make connections with data, you can make predictions with data, and do it at machine speed, which means instantaneously. So the tension with human machine teaming and with the Centaur is, how do you maintain human control and cognizance over what's occurring at machine speed without losing the advantages of operating at machine speed? That's the essence of the Centaur's dilemma. And in each construct, there's an ethical challenge to figure out how much human control to assert in advance, how much control to assert at the time of use, and that sort of thing. So that's the Centaur's dilemma from my standpoint. Thank you.
So, so AI is one of those terms that increasingly it proxies for a lot of different things. It's very difficult to define, and it gets used in all sorts of ways. So what is your kind of starting point, just baseline definition of what AI constitutes? And, you know, what's it well suited for? And then also what are some of its limitations?
Thanks. So there are many different definitions of AI, and academics can make a career of writing books about that. I'm sure some will. I've settled on one definition that I sort of, first of all, I don't like the concept artificial intelligence, and I'll say why in a second, but in terms of a definition, I like the definition used by the National Security Commission on Artificial Intelligence, which is sitting right now and is intended to take a look at obviously at how we approach this topic in the national security area. And here's their definition, or their statement about AI. AI is not a single piece of hardware or software, but rather a constellation of technologies that gives a computer system the ability to solve problems and perform human tasks that would otherwise require human intelligence. So the couple things that are strong about this definition is it refers to both hardware and software, so different types of machine pieces, but also a constellation of technologies. So the advent of the modern era of AI, so we know AI has been around since Alan Turing first came up with the concept of artificial intelligence and computing machines and the Turing test with his paper in 1950. And some would say it actually goes back to Bletchley Park. But AI went through these ups and downs. They call them AI winters, and they never quite got out of winter. Occasionally they came to spring, they sniffed a few buds, and they went back to winter. But in the past 10, 20 years, but really the past 10 years, there are a couple of technological things that have occurred that really allowed AI to go from conceptual to winter to spring. And now the issue is, are we in summer, and how hot's it going to get? And the things that have occurred, we have data, so that the advent of huge swaths of data, the algorithm development, and sensor development, and the study of the brain. These are all things that came along, plus cloud computing, because where are you going to stick all this data? You got to have the computational capacity to process all this data with these algorithms you're inventing. So these things all came along. Oh, by the way, about the same time that Google, Facebook, and all those actors came along. So now all of a sudden you had the synergy that would allow AI to burst forth from this sort of cold spell of AI winters. So back to the definition, and then some of the limitations. So I like the fact that it's a constellation of technologies, because we tend to focus on, Amazon shopping algorithms or something like that. It's a wide range of things, and it's performing human tasks or solving problems that would otherwise require human intelligence. But it's not saying, so this is the part I like, another thing I like about the definition, it's not saying it's acting with human intelligence, it's saying it would otherwise require human intelligence. And this gets off the anthropomorphism and the robotic Terminator line of stuff, and into the capacity of machines. Machines, by the way, that are doing what humans have told them to do, not what they've decided to do on their own. So that's one of the limitations. What are the limitations? Some of the limitations, we talked today about narrow AI. So it's odd to say it's narrow AI, and then some people call it different things, but it's AI that can perform specific or singular tasks. But one thing to know about AI, and it took you'll get it immediately. Anybody on this call will get it immediately, but it took me a while to figure out what the essence of the task was, which is prediction. AI is using data and formulas, sometimes math formulas, but algorithms are formulas. You can call them recipes if you want, but they're formulas that tell a machine what to do with data in a sense. And it took me a long time to figure out that it's all about prediction. And it's a mistake to think about AI outputs as answers. They're predictions. So let me give you an example of how AI is a prediction. The FBI has done since 2011 about 500,000 facial recognition searches using its facial recognition algorithm on national databases, largely licensed databases from states. So your pictures, by the way, you've been part of these searches, and they've conducted about 390,000 searches of 460,000 images. And let me just make sure my facts are right. No, as you were, 390 facial recognition searches of 641 million faces. So size of data is important. And where do you get 641 million faces? You get it from licensed databases and other places. So when the FBI, when GAO looked at the FBI's facial recognition app and said, is it any good? What they learned was the FBI's recognition app was accurate 86% of the time when it produced 50 possible matches. So what it was doing was, it wasn't like in the movies where they go, and then Jason Bourne's picture comes out, and there he is in the train station. To the contrary, on those occasions when the algorithm was able to produce 50 possible matches, 86% of the time, one of them was actually the match. But the person who made the match was the human who came in and said, let me look at these 50 and see if we can figure out if there's a match here. So that's prediction. That's not, here's your guy, that's prediction. What is it? It's brittle. So AI is brittle. And by brittle, they mean, and by the way, if you use the word brittle, someone will either think you're an expert in AI or you're talking about candy or something. But brittle is the concept that AI doesn't have situational awareness. And we've seen this with some of the driverless car scenarios where driverless cars have hit things. And you're like, what's with that? Like there was a case in Arizona where a driverless car with a safety driver, by the way, hit a person on a bike at night. And the problem there was, until it was too late, the AI algorithm wasn't able to figure out what the heck the object was in the form of a person on a bike at night, because it hadn't been trained to do that with data. So that's situational awareness. A human who had never seen a person on a bike at night would have been able to figure out that was a person on a bike at night, not the AI. It took too long. And that's situational awareness. And so you think about that when you talk about autonomous weapon systems, for example, think about that brittleness, the brittlosity, and that sort of thing. That's not using AI's strength. AI's strength would be trying to get a pattern, find an anomaly, or find a pattern that helps you make a prediction. So there's lots of, and I can give you some examples, but it's up to other Jamie if she wants me to go down that rabbit hole.
So you've made the case for why it's so important for folks in national security to think about AI, and you've laid out some of kind of the limitations that can be areas of concern for the application of AI in the context of national security in terms of its brittleness, the kind of speed at which it can make decisions, and all these sorts of things. But one of the topics we often hear a lot about with AI is the whole issue of bias, right? That the training data on which algorithms are sharpened and improved or created, any biases kind of present in those data are going to be reproduced by the AI system. So what do you think is the role, or how do we think about this issue of bias in the context of AI in national security? Are the issues the same as when we talk about AI more broadly, or is there something specific about the implications of AI and bias in conversations about national security?
So excellent question, fair question. Can I just pick up a scrap I left on the table last time? You had indicated what were some of the limitations, and I just wanted to bring up something that the Jason report for DoD had brought up, which is all the illities: reliability, connectability, interoperability. These are some of the weaknesses of AI right now. It's not necessarily the weakness of the algorithm or the precise application, but it's the ability to connect AI together to make it interoperable. An example of that is this recent alpha dogfight thing, which some of you will have picked up on, where a AI-driven algorithm flying an F-16 was able to defeat the Top Gun human pilot. And it was very impressive. It was a DARPA project, a DARPA challenge, and lots of flashing lights. This is a big deal. This is like the first AI beating someone at chess and the first AI beating someone at Go and so on. And it turned out one of the reasons that the AI application was a better one-on-one dogfighter was because the algorithm-driven aircraft was willing to fly at the edge of the aircraft's capability in a way that the human was not, right? Because it had no fear of death. It had no fear of fatigue. It had no fear. So it was taking advantage of the fact that it was genuinely flying at the edge of performance. But what it couldn't do is command other aircraft or queue up targets or decide which targets to attack first. It was great one-on-one, but it couldn't do all these other things like command and control of other aircraft. It couldn't ensure that it hadn't been hacked. So this is where all these illities come in. And so before we get carried away with AI, we need to remember the illities. And that's where this intersection of law, policy, and technology is very, very important in terms of addressing those. It's also important, see the segue, to address bias. And here, bias is obviously, we have people's attention now on the topic of bias. And one of the things I liked about your question, Jamie, is because you focused on, is there something different about national security? So first, when we talk about bias with AI, we're talking about things like data bias, more on that in a second, design bias. Did you craft an algorithm that actually isn't going to successfully perform the task you hoped it would perform? Unwitting human bias, the bias we all may bring. By the way, academics are sort of ahead of the game in understanding the concept of implicit bias, but we worry about the bias we may unwittingly bring to the equation. And then, of course, there's an intentional human bias as well. And depending on Jamie's desires, we can talk about each in depth or not. But one of the things I'd say about bias in national security, which is we don't have, in Jamie Baker's view, we don't have the luxury to turn away from AI applications that can provide valuable national security purposes or tools. That's my view, at least, right? So as a judge, if you came to me and said, hey, we got this great algorithm, it'll tell you exactly who should get parole, who shouldn't get parole, who should be out on bail, who shouldn't be out on bail, I'd be like, that's what judges do. show me the algorithm, show me who programmed the algorithm, show me what data they relied on. And by the time I was asking my 79th question, they would have gone away and said, no, no, over to you, Judge, you do it. That's a place where you can walk away from the algorithm until it has been proven, and it hasn't been, by the way, but until it's been proven that such algorithms actually augment judges' judgment in a wise and proper way. Hasn't been shown yet that these algorithms can do that. There's a debate about that, but we can choose not to use the algorithm, or we can choose to accent the human role in the Centaur's dilemma, which is the judge's role. In national security land, I don't think we can turn away from a tool that may potentially unlock valuable intelligence. Or you can turn away and say, well, facial recognition has not been demonstrated to be as accurate when looking for or trying to match or trying to predict faces that come from people of color or gender, women. So we, as a general matter, facial recognition is more accurate when trying to match white males. And that's partly not because there's somebody who's drafted an algorithm that says, oh, I especially like white males and want to find bad white males. It's because most of the data, a lot of the data on which the algorithms are being trained is derived from pictures of white males. And just like if I show you one picture of a naval ship and then ask you to figure out which of the next pictures I've shown you is a destroyer and which is a battleship and which is from the Japanese fleet and which is from the US fleet, you're gonna be like, I've seen one picture, I don't know. But if I show you thousands or hundreds of thousands of pictures of different ships, you can start picking out which is a destroyer, which is a battleship, which is a Japanese battleship. You get it. You see more data is better, even for humans. And this is true of AI right now as well. But we can't just say, oh, we don't like facial recognition because of the potential for bias, and it's absolutely there. Because what if you're looking for a terrorist? Or what if you're looking for a lost child? Or what if you're looking for something that actually requires you to be able to distinguish between a male and a female, or the gait of a female versus the gait of a male? You want to be able to have algorithms that can actually be biased in terms of identifying a female versus a male, but you want it to do it accurately, right? That's the trick. You can't just say, oh, we don't want that, but you better be sure that you have safeguards in place that if you use it wisely and safely and understand its limitations. Hence the use of that FBI example where I tried to point out that AI doesn't mean it's right. The formula may be wrong, the weighting may be wrong, the data may be wrong. And of course, we've all seen horrible, we know these stories about different scenarios where they've used AI to do things and it's come out in a really knuckleheaded way. The most recent example, well, there's many recent examples, but one recent example is when because of COVID, the UK system for doing the university test, they had the clever idea, since they couldn't give the test, they'd run AI algorithms against the prior grades and tests of the kids. But they took out the Centaur. They just did machines. They just had the algorithms predict what you'd get on the test, and predictably and correctly so, they had to throw the whole thing out. They completely missed the bit about human machine teaming, and went right with machine decision making. But I can give you an example of how I don't want to steal your thunder, Jamie, but I want to give an example of where AI example how it is very useful, because I think there's a tendency to have skepticism about AI, especially when you talk about bias, especially when you talk about facial recognition, and especially when you talk about anything involving authoritarian regimes using AI, as China does to track Uyghurs and others, by the way. But an example of how AI is good at prediction and why we should care that we develop it wisely and well. In India, there's a problem with diabetic blindness. And there's 70 million people in India who are diabetic, as it turns out, which is a pretty high number. And that means 70 million people who are quite vulnerable to becoming blind through diabetic blindness. And it's also clear that if you catch it early, it's very distinguishable. And if you catch it early, you can treat it and you don't go blind. The problem is for every let me get my numbers right. For every 1 million people in India, there are 11 ophthalmologists. So basically, you're not getting in to see the eye doctor, and you're not getting in to see the eye doctor if you're from a rural or poor area. Here comes AI. AI can then take pictures of people's eyes and match the interior pattern of your eye to detect those eyes that are susceptible or showing manifestations of early onset of diabetic blindness. They match them against a database set in the United States, by the way, where they've collected all the data of all eyes that have ever been potentially diabetic and so on, so they can start seeing where the patterns align and so on. That doesn't tell you who's going to be blind. That tells you who are the people should get in to see the eye doctor first. So they're using it, great team, machine, human teaming, to figure out of the 70 million, who gets in to see the 11 doctors, or the 1 million who gets in to see the 11 doctors. And that's a great example of how AI, using its data predictive capabilities, can help screen in advance certain things. Okay, thank you. Good day.
So you started your answer by making an argument for what we might call model transparency, or is often called explainability, right? The idea that that we should know what went into shaping how an algorithm makes a prediction or makes a decision, and then we should be able to explain the outcome. And this is a wider conversation around AI. And those are the questions you would ask as a judge about an AI system that makes predictions or recommendations for parole. So my question is, when we start to think about that push for model transparency or explainability, are the rules different when we talk about national security? So from an industry perspective, companies say we don't, model transparency, that's proprietary data. You sometimes get pushback, but in the context of national security, is there an argument for more model transparency, or might there be an argument for less, with the idea that if you open up how your AI is working, it might make nations more vulnerable?
Okay, great. I thought you were headed to the black box, but instead you're making a different transparency argument, and I think well done, because there's multiple levels of transparency and issues here. I'm just making notes to make sure I say three things. So the first issue with AI, there's a thing called machine learning, and part of the revolution with AI is that is the revolution in machine learning. And machine learning is basically a machine learning. It actually defines itself. The most fruitful so far and most popular mechanism to teach a machine to learn is a mechanism called deep learning. And that's where a lot of the action is now, but not all the action. But deep learning involves the application of neural networks. And neural networks is basically between the input and the output layer of an AI application. Their neural networks are the layers programmed within the algorithm in the machine to break down data and make connections between data in many different ways. And that's often referred to as the black box, because no one really knows. They genuinely don't. I thought I was the only person who had no idea what was going on. It turns out like smart people don't know that either, including the people who designed the algorithm. They don't know what connections within the black box the algorithm is making in weighting, and whether when it identifies me as the bank robber, is it because my earlobe matches the same pattern of the bank robber's earlobe, or is it because my eyebrow was a certain way, or was it because I was white, or was it because I limped? Who knows? They don't know. They only know at the end that my output came out and I was one of the 50 pictures in the FBI pile that might be a match. So that's one form of transparency. which is, should you rely on something that you don't fully understand how you got to the output? And the people who design algorithms and the people who use AI right now are pretty good about, but not always, about asking the right questions about what the heck happened and should we rely on the output. One of the things I point out in my book is I give a list of questions that policymakers and national security lawyers should make sure they're asking before they rely on any AI output as a predictive mechanism. For example, false positive rates, false negative rates, all that sort of thing. And how are those fed back in to the machine? So that's one form of transparency. Should you rely on something that even the experts can't fully explain or articulate? Second, to what extent should you rely on something where you can't know what the algorithm was designed to capture, the predictive elements of the algorithm? Now, I don't think in national security I would accept a concept where you could not tell me, the person who designed, the person using the algorithm or promoting its use could not explain to me how the algorithm was originally designed. Now, a lot of algorithms, like the Google search algorithm, is a living mechanism. And so it was originally written as code by a human, but based on machine learning, it rewrites itself and adjusts to searches and patterns and all that sort of thing. So, but you certainly, if you're in the national security world, you should not accept a system that doesn't tell you how that algorithm was originally designed and what it was originally intended to capture and weight in terms of what it was looking for. That's different than then saying, but I'd be happy to share that with the Chinese and the public. That's a different level of transparency. But there was something you said at the beginning, Jamie, that I think is very important, and I'm glad you pulled it out of my book, because it was a message I was hoping I was delivering, and so I'm glad it was one of the sort of central messages you heard in the book, which is a couple of the messages. One, I don't want Google making national security policy for the United States any more than I want the Department of Defense. I want the United States, the Congress, the legislative branch, the executive branch as a whole to make policy. So that's one message. But another message, oh crud, I lost my train of thought. That it's a lot easier to regulate something before it's embedded in the culture of the national security apparatuses of the countries involved. You don't regulate weapons after one country or another gets the weapon and realizes it or believes it has an advantage over the other guy. So if you're going to impose limitations or red lines or prohibitions on, say, like deep fakes or whose data you use, that kind of thing, it's best to do it before one side or the other figures out why it's to their advantage to do it. And that was something you accented at the beginning, Jamie Winders, which I think is quite right. This is, even though the AI world is in spring or early summer, it's time to move the law and ethics process forward quickly, so that we can try and embed a sound process and ethics into it, and not play catch up after it's already embedded in the culture, doctrine, and use patterns of the national security apparatuses of the different states.
So we have some great questions from folks in the audience. So we'll move through them and kind of rapid fire. So the first question, and I'm going to read this from my phone where they're being sent to me, is, are there particular topics within this intersection of law, policy, and AI technology that would be better addressed as a matter of international law rather than national security law? Or is it simply too early to think internationally because we don't yet have our arms or heads around the national security implications?
Fine question. Just as a semantic vernacular thing, in my definition of national security law, that includes US law, international law, constitutional law, foreign law. But that's not the import of the question. The import of the question was, is this best regulated at this time through ethical principle, through statute, through reliance on constitutional law alone, or through international law? And one of the points I make in the book is what happens when a legal regime is nascent or is not fully developed or fully applicable to what you're applying that regime to, right? So it's fair to say that the National Security Act of 1947, as amended, was not drafted with AI in mind, right? We can kind of stipulate to that, nor was any other law, frankly. So the question is, what do you do when the law is not a perfect fit? First of all, I've heard some people tell me the law is a perfect fit. Please go away. We're doing fine without you. And you can guess where that might be coming from. So I'm like, knock, knock, knock. No, I'm actually going to stay here if you don't mind. So what happens? One, lawyers apply the law they have. So you take the National Security Act of 1947, you take IEPA, you take the Defense Production Act, and you apply it anyway. And sometimes it's a good fit, sometimes it isn't, and so on. Second, you always have constitutional law. You fall back on constitutional law when no other thing applies, because the Constitution always applies. And with AI, the Fourth Amendment, the Fifth Amendment, the First Amendment are very relevant and apt. So we always have that to apply. And then what else do lawyers do? Lawyers look for analogy and metaphor. And I've recommended that we look to some of the lessons from arms control, not arms control per se, but some of the lessons about regulating and trying to control dual use items like chemical weapons, which are also hard to verify. And also the law of armed conflict, which has concepts like command responsibility. In the military, we don't accept that we don't know who's responsible. We know the commander's responsible for everything his unit does or doesn't do, or he should have known they were doing or not doing. So we can apply the same concept to AI. You may not understand what's going on in the black box, but you sure as heck are responsible for what happens and how it's used. Now I've lost. International law. International law is going to be tough. So one of the things is, first of all, a lot of the attention with international law right now is on lethal autonomous weapon systems, so-called killer robots. Please don't focus on that. Don't focus on super intelligence and is the machine going to eat us, as Vladimir Putin asked in 2017. That's super artificial intelligence. And autonomous weapon systems, we've had them in the United States military, arguably since the 1950s. It's not a new concept. And it's not, frankly, what's driving AI in the national security space. And it's pulling a lot of the attention away from what should be looked at right now, which is where we are, which is logistics, intelligence, medicine. There's a lot of things that are going to happen long before autonomous weapon systems, with one exception, cyberspace. And you can call some of the stuff that happens in cyberland a weapon, or you can call it something else, but it's there now, whether we call it a weapon or not. But in any event, we see in the killer robot debates, and I disregard that term, that international law is really not going to work at that level. It might work on a bilateral level, which is also international law, like an extradition treaty is international law, but it's a bilateral extradition treaty usually. So you might have an agreement with the Five Eyes, for example, about how AI will or will not be used in national security for certain national security purposes, but you're not going to get the Chinese and the Russians in the United States and Luxembourg to agree on AI red lines. And if they agree, you're not going to trust it for more than 1 second. And one of the people, by the way, who's done a great deal of important work with us in this area is Matt Middlestedt and Lori Hobart, who come to us, Matt from the Maxwell School. We've looked at this issue of verification, because there's a mythology that with code you can never verify anything. And how can you have law and regulation or treaties or anything like that if you can't verify it? And it turns out there are certain things you can do and certain things you cannot do. And oddly enough, no one had really looked at this issue until Matt came along. And as a group and a team, we looked at this issue of verification. And there are things you can do. But international law is not my go-to place. What I would do in international space is confidence building measures. That's one of the lessons from arms control, which is you're not going to trust the other guy not to do certain things, but you might build mechanisms that are vehicles to talk and chat and learn about what might be happening so you don't misperceive something and escalate unnecessarily. So confidence building measures is a place where some form of international law might work. But that wouldn't be my go-to. I'd get our own house in order first.
So we have another
Long-winded
question.
answer. That's a risk you get. That was a short answer, by the way.
So I assume Israel's Iron Dome uses AI to predict where an incoming missile will land. What are the ethical considerations of AI on the battlefield and therefore on national security?
We have a counter battery weapon that you know, this is back to this constellation of technologies, right? So there's many ways to argue almost anything is AI in a way, and there's also this game where any machine that does anything is AI. So it's one of my big takeaways and messages to anybody in this field is, unlike, say, the law of armed conflict targeting, where you can apply principles like necessity, proportionality, military objective, and so on, in all contexts. That's one of the virtues of the law of armed conflict and targeting. The law and the principle that we should be applying to AI is going to be very case specific. It's really, if you're going to apply a concept like necessity or a concept like transparency or a concept like equity, you can't just say, and thus it is done. You have to look at the specific AI application. Now I lost train, Iron Dome, oh, law of armed conflict. So it will not surprise you that there's a section in the book on the law of armed conflict. And the first concern is anything that involves weaponization, right? So the actual direct weaponization of an AI-driven algorithm, AI application. Do you want it to make the kill or no kill decision? And that's what the killer robot debate is largely about. In DoD speak, we talk about a human being in the loop, on the loop, or out of the loop. And I think most commanders would never, would always argue on the loop or in the loop, making the decision based on the principle of command responsibility. They don't want to surrender it to an algorithm they don't understand. But there are certain weapon systems where you have to surrender. The phalanx system, which tracks incoming projectiles onto naval vessels, is not going to operate if you're individually making a human choice every time the weapon fires. It's going to have to combine computerization and so on, and data, immediate machine speed data analytics to the process of defending the ship. The law of armed conflict, couple things. It goes back to what's AI good at and what it's not good at. And it's not good at situational awareness. That makes me nervous about surrendering the targeting decision, except in rare instances to a machine, AI-driven machine. But it is good at data links and pattern recognition. So I do want it to tell me what to target. And you'd be like, oh, that's outrageous. You're going to use AI to target. I'm like, okay, would you rather have the Lance Corporal looking through 19 hours of video feed, trying to figure out whether the person who went into that building is a terrorist or not, falling asleep, this is fatigue, bored out of his mind or her mind, and then coming to that person saying, well, is that or is that not a proper military object? And why not have the AI algorithm help you identify which 4 minutes in the 19 hours of feed is the critical 4 minutes, because that's the 4 minutes that something happened. And now you have the human analyst work and figure out what's the meaning of that 4 minutes, and why do we care about it? And is it a proper target or is it not a proper target? Human machine teaming. I point that out because it's easy to fall into the trap of saying AI is good or AI is bad. It's like covert action, it's like rendition, it's like many national security tools. It's good if used wisely, and well, it's bad if used unwisely and poorly. But if it can strengthen US national security, and by that I mean also our legal values, and we live up to our legal values, then we should be happy for it and glad for it. And the person whose life it's going to save because of the medical connections is going to be glad for it. And so we can't just walk away from it. Logistics, it's going to save lives because you can run logistics using AI rather than humans to drive convoys, that sort of thing. That's here today. So there's a lot of good uses, but also, as Dean Van Slyke said at the beginning, there's positive applications and there's also some serious negative implications. That's where law policy come in to regulate the two.
So this is a perfect place for me to turn it back over to Dean Van Slyke, because we've come full circle, right? Back to that central mission of Maxwell as an institution of thinking about all of these issues through the lens of the public good, right? Of both the positive aspects, but also what might be the concern. So I'm going to turn things over to our Dean to wrap up the discussion.
I just want to really thank Judge Baker and Professor Winders for such an insightful and illuminating conversation on the topic of artificial intelligence. I hope this session offered you 4 takeaways. First, the social sciences, policy and governance and law are at the intersection of teaching and research in Maxwell and at SU. The collaborative and multidisciplinary work being done by people like Jamie and Jamie is forward-facing, and it has relevance in a number of areas. Second, our students, some of whom are with us today, are gaining knowledge and experiences that position them for internships and jobs. And if you can help, we'd be delighted to engage you. Third, if you're involved in these areas and would like to be helpful to our continued work, please contact us and reach out. We'd welcome finding opportunities for collaboration and engagement. And fourth, I hope you see the types of extraordinary faculty that we invest in, the topics they do research and teach on, the incredibly ambitious students they work with, and the kinds of training those students receive. Your philanthropic investments in SU and at Maxwell can help further this type of work and help us create new opportunities for exploration and investigation and demonstrate the relevance of an SU education. If you're interested in making a gift, we'd be very appreciative. Before we conclude, I want to offer our thanks to Maxwell's outstanding information and computing technology team for supporting this event, and to Jess Murray and Lane Norton and the Maxwell Advancement team for organizing today's discussion. Please watch your email for additional virtual events this winter that will feature opportunities to engage with Maxwell faculty and your fellow graduates. If you have ideas for future topics or members of the faculty you'd like to hear from, or other suggestions for these events, please submit them to us at alum@maxwell.syr.edu. Thank you so much for attending today's session. We hope that you and your loved ones remain healthy and well, that you have a great holiday season, and go Orange. Thanks so much for being here.